Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. Today on the podcast, we have lots of people, which is fun, and really excited to have all four of these women on the podcast. We've got Dr. Amoy Hugh-Pennie. Am I saying that right?
Yes,
Good.
perfect.
Dr. Denise Ross, Dr. Margo Uwayo, and Dr. Mya Hernandez. Welcome to the podcast, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So awesome. Before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about where I'm producing this podcast. I'm producing this podcast on the stolen lands of the Tla'amin, Klehus, Homoko, and Comox First Nations, who were one nation before we settlers came in and separated them all into reserves. I do just want to sort of bring some attention to something that's actually kind of relevant in that when I was reading the first page of sort of the main article that we're going to be talking about today, there was a reference to native boarding schools. And so, as folks will know, or some folks will know, they've been kind of following these stories. I think it was in May 2021, like a year. Yeah, it was almost a year to the day after the George Floyd murder, was the uncovering of 215 child graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is about, I don't know, as the crow flies, about 4 hours east of where I'm at. Here in British Columbia. And what we saw sort of following that was a lot more of these schools tried to secure the funding from the government to do the work to see if they had sort of similar grave sites on their lands. And they're using this technology called ground penetrating radar, which is kind of like a ground sonar sort of thing to sort of determine things. Anyway, sort of over the span of sort of the 2021, 2022, there was quite a lot of information coming out. I think the numbers were well over 10,000 graves had been uncovered. But just sort of a small percentage of the schools. So I believe there's 150 residential schools in Canada, in sort of the 1800s, 1900s. And I think they've only done scans like 6 schools so far. Anyway, they just a couple of days ago, the St. Mary's Residential School in Kenora, Ontario, which for geography folks is smack dab right in the center of Canada. It's a town out in far northwest Ontario, probably 200 miles from the Manitoba border. And the St. Mary's Residential School operated from 1897 to 1972. Anyway, they just completed their scans and they found 170 plausible child burials on the site, which is just wild. And something like the estimate was something like 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their homes and forced to live in these schools to be kind of assimilated into Western culture. There were no way schools, and in fact were every way concentration camps. In fact, when I had Grant Bruno on the podcast, I think it's episode 37, he's a First Nations man and a father of a young boy with autism, and we were talking a lot about sort of autism and Indigenous culture. I actually got a couple more interviews coming up related to that, but he was saying that I think it was the Indian agents back in the day. So these folks were called Indian agents that came and essentially, directed the removal of all these children from their homes. And in fact, I talk a lot about it on other episodes. The town that I live closest to is a town called Powell River, which is named after a guy named Israel Powell, who was the primary provincial Indian agent that pulled everyone away. So there's actually a massive movement to change the name of the town right now to Tisquat, which is the original indigenous name of the area. But point being, he apparently, I don't know if it was Israel himself, but they apparently designed the residential schools. It was the residential schools or the reserves, one of the two. They designed them based off of the concentration camps from the Holocaust. No, sorry. Pardon me. I've got my dates reversed. Hitler designed his concentration camps based on the residential schools. Got my dates wrong. Yeah, because the residential schools were all in the 1800s. And so he thought, and so essentially this was in there's no other word for it but a genocide, and just so many more. Anyway, I just want I bring that up not to sort of be a downer or whatnot, but I think sort of the talk about the residential schools has kind of faded from the news quite a bit, and I think it's just important to keep talking about it. I'll leave it there, but just I'll finish with encouraging folks who may be triggered or traumatized by this conversation about residential schools and sort of things related to it, that you can call the National Residential School Crisis Line, 1-866-925-4419. And if you're looking for a great place just to donate, and if you're looking to sort of put your money where your mouth is, the Crisis Line is a wonderful charity. 24 hours a day they operate, and they're doing really good things. So thank you for that. So getting to the topic of today, this kind of all came out of the article you folks all got together writing about the culturally relevant pedagogy, a word I have not been able to pronounce up until quite recently, and some really kind of cool stuff coming out of that. So I'm looking forward to kind of diving into that. But before we kind of get to it, and this could take up half the episode, as we have 4 wonderful people here with all unique stories. I like to get folks' origin stories about kind of how they got into the field, and kind of doing this work, but also kind of finish it up with sort of how you all became connected with each other as well. So if anyone wants to start.
Denise.
Sure, I'll start.
There you go. Forced.
So my name is Denise Ross-Page. I've been working in the field now for probably 30 years. I think close to 30 years. I think so. If you count the beginning of graduate school till now as
Sure.
being in the field. I attended Spelman College. While I was there, I decided I wanted to work with kids with disabilities, and I wanted to focus on behavior. At the time, it was behavior disorders, emotional behavior disorders, and I wanted to go to Columbia University. And when I did, I went there, and the program was a behavior analysis program. I worked under Doug Greer and finished my master's and doctorate there. And then I went on to teach at a university, and I've stayed at universities. And that's how I've been connected to everyone on this podcast. So that's how that happened. And I'll let them tell the rest of the stories.
Cool.
So.
Thanks, Denise.
My name is Amoy Hugh-Pennie, and I am connected to Dr. Denise Ross through Columbia University Teachers College. I've been in the field 26 years, and probably a little more if you count the 2 years of undergrad on this track in psychology. So how I got into this field, I've been studying psychology since high school. I was a peer counselor in high school. I did psychology undergrad, and I saw a sign on the wall asking about working with children with autism as like independent study. And back then it was, when will I ever get a chance to work with children with autism? Now there aren't nearly enough people to do that. So that was kind of my track. I serendipitously worked as a teaching assistant, because you can't do anything with a BA in psychology, when I moved to New Jersey. And just so happened that at that school, there were some consultants from Dr. Greer's program setting up a QABA's program. And that's how I ended up going to Columbia University, kind of interviewed and had enough credentials to get in. So different people end up on different paths, and that's kind of how I got on mine, and did my master's and my doctorate there, and TA'd under Dr. Denise Ross when she was teaching there, and then went on to do a lot of adjunct teaching because I really enjoyed doing clinical work and teaching. So I did a lot of work in schools as a behavior analyst and BA supervisor in schools and then in school administration while doing college teaching as well.
Cool.
I can go next.
Yeah.
I'm Mya Hernandez. I currently live in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I ended up at Western for my undergrad and Western Michigan University, and took one of my first classes there was Principles of Behavior taught by Dr. Malat and his grad student assistants. And I just fell in love with that class. And for me, it was, there's definitely like an aha moment in behavior analysis where the basic principles of behavior, I saw them everywhere. And I was like, yes, this is, I love using this science to help improve people's lives. And Dick's big message was save the world with behavior analysis. And that always really spoke to me, and seeing all the possibilities that we could make the world a better place. And so I decided to stay and do my master's in his BATS program. And that's where I was so lucky to have Dr. Denise Ross as an instructor. And she was just amazing. She blew me away. I was looked up to her in that moment, continued to look up to her and admire her. And just the amazing work that she's been doing with literacy and language. And having her as an instructor and a mentor, she had encouraged me to continue to do my Ph.D., which I did with her. And now I work at Lake Michigan College, which is a community college in Southwest Michigan. And I love the students that I work with. I love continuing to spread the good word of behavior analysis to the future and seeing where the students take it.
Nice. Does that community college have an undergrad program or?
So we do a associate's program. We do have a small psychology department, which my department head, it's just me and my department head, Dr. Amy Scrima. She actually did her doctorate at Western also, but in OBM. And we actually just started last year. We started teaching principles of behavior there. We used Dr. Malat's book, and we started a practicum site with a local autism center called Logan Autism Center. So we're really pushing the pipeline of behavior analysis for students there that we've had transfer to other major universities in the state and out of state.
Right on. I constantly get confused by Western because we now have Western University in Canada, which also has an ABA program, and it's also not that far from you folks in London, Ontario. But I keep remembering, and I was like, all these people went to Western. Oh, all these cool folks went to Western, and none of them went to Western.
I actually taught at Western, Ben.
Did you? Oh,
yeah, I was the ABA program advisor at University of Western Ontario for a while there, and I was an adjunct professor there for about 3-4 years.
Well, it's not surprising because I did see that one of the articles that you wrote with the two of the professors from Brock, Nicole Luke and somebody else.
Yes, Gabrielle Zai, who is also at Western after me.
Right.
Nicole and I were there for a little while together.
Nice,
Dr. Luke.
Nice. Oh, right on. And Margo?
Hi, I'm Mark. My name is Margaret Uwayo. I go by Margo. And I got into the field of ABA by accident. I wanted to study clinical psychology. Actually, when I started out, I was taking undergraduate courses in psychology, but my thought was to go into clinical psychology and specifically to sort of study trauma. Just kind of, I guess maybe my own personal history led me to kind of be curious about that and want to do that kind of work. And so I went to a local community college and got my associates, and then I went to Western to complete my bachelor's. And one of the requirements Western had was you have to take Dr. Dick Malat's 3600 course, Introduction to Behavior Analysis. So as soon as I took that course, and just like I said, it made sense, and I was able to apply the principles. And I think as I learned more about the different options within the field of psychology, I felt like this was empirical, it's parsimonious, I can make sense of it, I can apply it, and I can see outcomes. And I think that's what drew me to to do the APA work in general. So I'm connected to everyone here because I completed my master's and doctorate at Western Michigan University. So I studied under Jake Malat as an undergrad, and during my first year of master's, I studied with him as well. He encouraged me to, check out other opportunities and really connected me with Denise Ross. Dr. Denise Ross, who became my mentor as a second year master's student, and also throughout my doctorate program. And I had lots of opportunities to work with Dr. Ross right before I entered her program. So we got to know each other. I got to participate in some of the research that she was doing. And I think that's what kind of turned me on into the work of, focusing on literacy and educational outcomes for children, particularly individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's how I got into that space. At this time, right now, I'm back in Kalamazoo. I moved around a little bit. I was exploring, my options, wanting to know exactly where I fit. So right now, I'm working as a senior director of behavioral health and academic success at YWCA Kalamazoo, which is a local nonprofit organization. And I'm also serving as an executive director of QABA, which is QABA with a K, not a C, which is a new nonprofit organization, private school that we are starting. Dr. Mala and I are working on starting in West Michigan, in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So that's where I'm at right now.
Really cool. So YWCA, that sounds like a bit of a unique gig, right? Like, are there a lot of behavior analysts working in YWCAs and YMCAs? I know there was a local Y, I think, somewhere in Vancouver that had some kind of behavioral program, which I didn't even know those were happening. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got to be working at the Y? That just sounds cool.
Oh my goodness, that's a long story, but I'll keep it short.
Okay.
So I made the connection with YWCA because in our doctoral program with Denise Ross, we actually ran a reading program, a literacy, an ABA-based literacy program. And in that program, we recruited heavily within the community and families who just needed that support. And that's where we did our research and service work as well. And it so happened that one of the children we served, his parent is connected to the YWCA. And so when we're getting ready to start this school in Kalamazoo, one of the things we wanted to do is to spend time in the community providing service, building those connections, and also adding to, expanding and disseminating behavior analysis in this nonprofit world. And so I reached out to YWCA. I knew this individual there, so I reached out to them and I said, hey, we're trying to do this thing, and I know you have all these educational and maternal infant programs going on. Is there any way we can build a partnership and collaborate, and we could provide this service to the children that you serve and the families that you serve while we're preparing to set up our school and open our school? So that was a wonderful connection. I was able to, because we have that history, that's already buy-in. We provided behavior analytics services. They've seen that those outcomes and literacy services, and so it was kind of started to negotiate, and they said, yes, bring your literacy program. Not only that, let's look at establishing behavioral health services within YWCA and look at how we can apply behavior analysis to the classrooms where we provide educational services in early childhood. So that's kind of how that worked out together. So everybody's connected somehow, some way, and you always end up where you were started.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of the story there.
That's super cool. And is this somewhat connected to some of the research that I've seen Margo and Denise's name on related to sort of interventions for economically disadvantaged folks? And specifically, I don't know if it was one of those articles or not, but I vaguely remember reading somewhere, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was something about training parents who had low literacy to teach their kids who had low literacy. Was that, did I read that right?
Yeah, so that was my dissertation actually.
Oh.
And I don't think we made it quite clear, but Margo and I came up together at Western Michigan University. So we actually started the same year in Dr. Malat's program, and then also for doctorate. So we've been together through a lot. And yes, and so we've had some really awesome experiences starting practicum sites under Dr. Ross's guidance. And it of the many practicum sites we were at, one of them was the connection through which Margo is now starting has started the literacy school. It's running. It's been awesome. She's totally underselling it. It's so amazing. I got to volunteer a little bit over the summer to help out. It's awesome. I mean, they're taking kids from the community that are already kind of at the Y receiving services and catching them back up, getting off base. But that's, so some of the early practicum sites, we ran one out at Western Michigan University's out of one of their buildings in conjunction with their education department. And that's where a lot of our research started in our lab that we all did together.
So maybe Mya, maybe we have you back to talk about your dissertation and talk about, because I love that idea of teaching parents that don't read that well to teach their kids that don't read that well. That's wicked. I mean, the fact that you want to use behavior analysis to save the world, it sounds like you're all kind of doing that because you're already moving outside of sort of the autism sphere and just trying to help kids in any way you can.
Yeah. So my interest really came out of, we have other members in our lab. We have evidence-based practices for this is what we need to do when we get kids in school. They're behind in literacy, but they have all this time at home where they're not building that foundation of language skills. Yeah. And there are things very, I would say simple things, right? Reading to your kid at night or reading to your kid during the day at any time, having books in the home, and not just passive reading, but actively engaging. Margo does a lot with motivation, so making it a positive experience. And setting that groundwork was something that is often missing for parents who themselves struggle with literacy. And for me, I started doing research into looking at how, at least in our Kalamazoo community, we have our Goodwill organization had started a literacy program, but I went through the training and everything. And of course, right, we know how to train people. We have the research and science behind that, but we don't always use it. And so let's not only help adults gain better functional literacy skills, but also help teach them ways that they can stop that cycle of, the parent struggles with literacy, so then their child is more likely to struggle with literacy. Let's stop that cycle there so that when they come into school, they can be better prepared and not be so far behind their peers.
Super cool. Right on. I know, I think a lot of folks will recognize some of you from the Sadavoy Dubey book there, the Scientific Framework for Compassion and Social Justice. So I just want to put a quick plug out for the interview that the three of you did with the Shades of ABA podcast a bit ago, talking about all that stuff and income equality and those sorts of things. We won't talk about that today, but I just want to plug that episode for folks if they want to kind of learn more from you folks about some of the good work you were doing there. Maybe someone could sort of tell me why you got together to write this article, the culturally relevant pedagogy, say it again, and applied behavior analysis addressing educational disparities in PK to 12 schools. What was sort of the reason for this article?
Well, initially, essentially what it was a call for papers, a special issue by the Behavior Analysis and Practice, right around the time when of George Floyd's death.
Yes.
And it was asking for papers related to cultural relevance, papers related to how to address social injustice, how to address things like systemic racism, police brutality, and other areas of interest regarding disparities for underrepresented minorities in the United States. So, part of that starts with education, the educational system, teachers and children interaction with children, how they're brought up, and literacy being an issue of social justice. It's necessary to be able to read, to be able to communicate in that way to make your way through the world. There was a time when, it was against the law for African Americans to learn how to read in this country, right? So, it is a form of social justice to just be educated. And that's something that is highly valuable and highly valued in a lot of Black families and immigrant families. And to see that there is such a discrepancy between the achievement between underrepresented groups and the majority population in this country is an issue of social justice. So we wanted to address that, and we wanted to talk about ways that that could be addressed, considering that the majority of teachers are female and white and don't necessarily reflect their students, right? With the diverse population, that they're not as diverse as the students that they serve. So that being the case, a lot of things that are culturally relevant to their students are not always integrated into the curriculum. And so we wanted to address how those things could be done. And so we went about looking at, what makes teachers teachers of students of underrepresented groups, specifically Black children, successful in their teaching, and how that could be partnered with evidence-based strategies and tactics from applied behavior analysis in order to do that. So that's how we came together on, culturally relevant pedagogy. Gloria Latson-Billings and her research in that, the seminal research in that, and put that together with the strategies and tactics of applied behavior analysis in order to build a framework in which something could be successful within the educational system to address the issues and the disparities in reading outcomes for students.
Right on. You talk about literacy a bit there. Now, I kind of know the answer to some of this stuff, but I want to ask anyway for the listeners. I had Mae Bolbrin on, and before that, Dr. Nicole Hollins, and they talked a lot about sort of a lot of the issues in schools, and I sure encourage folks to go back to those to hear some more. But what are sort of literacy is certainly probably one of the biggest ones. What are some of the other kind of sort of disparities in the school system that sort of call for something like this?
I can answer that, or at least start it off. So,
sure. Are you looking to up your organization's governance game? Or maybe you need support to design interventions that have long-term sustainability. The British Columbia Association for Behavior Analysis will be hosting their 15th annual conference on March 3rd and 4th. The first day will be 2 virtual keynote sessions from Dr. Ramona Homenfar, who will be speaking on values-based governance, and Louis Bush with a presentation on designing function-based treatments that withstand the test of time. Remember, these will be virtual keynotes, so you can attend from anywhere around the world. If you're going to be in Vancouver that weekend, BCABA's second day will feature live presentations from local presenters, a poster session, and multiple network opportunities. For more information and to register, go to www.bcaba.org and click on the Events tab. That's bc-aba.org. Hope to see you there. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is literacy.
I currently work with the Institute for Urban Education at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And we're charged with helping to address disparities within Wisconsin schools. Okay. Particularly disparities in school districts where there's a there's a difference in the racial demographic of the teachers compared to the students, as Amoy was saying, and the ways in which that plays itself out in disproportionality. For instance, there are 9 school districts right now that have such high levels of disproportionality that children who are from historically marginalized groups tend to be taught by people who are long-term subs and those types of things. And so they're not getting what they need. Now that's worse for everybody post-COVID, but before COVID, it was really true for these districts. So we had to look at systems and how does disproportionality show itself up in education systems, and then which systems could we target? So literacy is definitely one of them. Gifted education is another one. Black and brown students are underrepresented in gifted education. You see it in STEM fields, whether it's through race or gender. Discipline is a huge. Black and brown students are disproportionately. They are disciplined at levels and rates that are much higher than other groups. And it actually becomes a civil rights issue for them. And so those are some of the areas that you see. I think you see it with Black boys. So a lot of the issues that you see are things where they are discriminated against through school systems.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the systems, and special ed is another one. There's overrepresentation of Black and brown children in special ed. And so those are well known, but those are some of the ways that you see it show up in schools.
Interesting. So I guess, yeah, and that's that. So the discipline stuff I've heard a lot about. I've heard a lot about, and then there's been some interesting kind of recent studies, I think, on this sort of thing. Things like, even sort of people not even answering folks when they raise their hand, or people, making noise in the classroom, and it's always the Black students being called out for doing it, while the white students, are being called out. Those sorts of things. What's sort of and that's definitely a big problem, and it seems like more of an obvious one. What are sort of some of the barriers that keep students like this out of a gifted program, or out of like a STEM program? What's sort of the reason for that? Is that literacy probably is one, but are there others?
Well, I think they're not. Even if Black children and white children are identical in their ability, identical in their preparation, identical in their performance, the presence of bias often stops people from having access. So in gifted education, for instance, they're not tested for gifted education. If they're in schools that have high poverty, even those programs aren't even available for them. And even if you think about advanced placement classes, they're not often identified for them. And so it's kind of the presence of bias really has a place in a lot of systems. You see it in medicine, you see it in healthcare, and this is true in education, that yes, there are children who are, because of a system, not learning to read. As behavior analysts, we know there's nothing wrong with the kids, right? They're brilliant kids. The system is broken. And so I think part of it is that there's the presence of bias, and it has to be acknowledged in the ways in which access to these types of programs, gifted education, for instance, STEM, AP classes, are not available. And even if they are, they're overlooked.
Sorry, and this is just maybe me and my lack of school knowledge. What's an AP class?
Advanced placement.
Oh,
so an advanced placement class. So how do you end up becoming a doctor, right? If you don't get to take those classes that place you in places that can make you competitive later on. And so if they don't have access to them, either because they're not available or because they are overlooked, even in the presence of all being equal to everyone else economically and in terms of education, there's still bias for Black and brown students. So.
Wow.
And I think before we even before they enter schools, a lot of these issues are already present within the community. And so parents don't have access to educational, quality education. They don't have access to, maybe they live in communities where they're dealing with a lot of poverty. And that's often impacted by systemic barriers that are in place that are limiting the resources that they have. So by the time the children are experiencing this in school systems, these biases, they've actually already experienced it even before they enter school. And so it's one of those, I think, issues where if it's not addressed far in advance from the beginning in early childhood, in preschool, in kindergarten, and really ensuring that children are receiving culturally relevant instructional strategies and literacy empowerment, then you're going to continue to experience those barriers. And I think the trajectory kind of worsens over time throughout those experiences. So I think there's sort of this relationship. It's not just isolated within schools. It's that individuals enter schools and they've already experienced those things, and now they also have to deal with it within schools. And so there's a lot for them to overcome to be able to access, resources later on.
The other issue is with that, when we're talking about bias, and oftentimes, it is not at the surface. It's not something that is that is recognized.
Right.
You don't always recognize your own biases, right? Because it's not that you say, oh, I don't think the Black student is bright. It's just that when it comes time for different opportunities, you don't necessarily say, hey, why don't you test for gifted, or why don't you test for advanced placement, in terms of offering those opportunities. And if you don't have parents or people around you or in your community that can advocate for those things,
right,
it's then you can't do that on your own, right? So in terms of being self-determined, so there's a whole idea of behind culturally relevant pedagogy is that it involves the community that the person is in. It involves being sociopolitically aware of how the outside affects everything for the child, right? So, we often talk about cross collaboration with others and looking at them as not just looking at the client or the person in front of us and dealing with just what we see, but getting that input from all of the different people that work with them and putting together a whole picture in order to be able to provide effective interventions for them, right? And that's what we're looking at in terms of culturally relevant pedagogy. It's involving the community, it's involving the parents, it's looking at them in a historical context, in their family, in the community, and in the school. So those are part of the issues and how they need to be addressed in order to move forward with these to have better outcomes. Some of the other concerns or issues around this is not just about race as a culture, but also disability. So you think about a lot of the students that we work with in the population of neurodivergent students, autistic, ADHD, et cetera. Oftentimes, the fact that they have such scattered skills and may be able to do some things well and not others, or that they're inconsistent, right, which is big in ADHD, things like that. You don't consider testing children like that for gifted. And if they engage in certain behaviors that function to gain attention or to escape difficult situations, or when they're feeling overwhelmed, then what is seen, what is visible and observable is the behavior. But what is not observable is that lack of working memory, that inability to self-regulate, that the fact that they didn't sleep, eat, or drink enough, right?
Yep.
So what ends up happening is, due to those biases, right, whether not acknowledged or not even known to the individual, they become labeled as a behavioral problem.
Yep.
And the diagnoses that they end up getting in special education become more aligned with conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder. And what happens is you end up sometimes with misdiagnoses, or not getting to the fact that especially children with ADHD often have many comorbid disorders. So you miss things like anxiety, depression. You miss things like a learning disability, like dyscalculia, right, for math, or dyslexia. So what ends up happening is the ball stops at behavior. And then they don't get other types of interventions that are necessary to improve literacy skills, to improve math skills. And then those opportunities then decrease. And over time, what was a disorder becomes a disability. So what was something small becomes an overall effect over time, left untreated, becomes much more difficult to overcome, makes your life more dysfunctional, makes it more difficult to navigate in the world, right? And then your learning history for those behaviors becomes more difficult to overcome as each year goes by, untreated or not having a full picture, which is why it's so important to collaborate with others in and outside of our field.
Yeah, I can totally relate on to that one. Just being an ADHD kid, but I wasn't diagnosed till I was in my 40s.
Same.
And so I was definitely the behavior kid. I was in some special ed. I didn't really know why. I remember doing some stuff with a speech path once to stop lisping. Yeah, definitely. None of those things. My working memory issues. My poor grades, my anxiety. I had crazy anxiety. Right up until around age 45, and once I got medicated, it all kind of went away. But well, not all of it, yeah, no, I could totally see that totally being a piece. I was wondering, before we kind of get into the sort of the meat of the article, you had mentioned also, I think Denise, you mentioned the sort of the disparity, not disparity, the sort of the disproportionality around sort of teachers and the students, sort of, so that a lot of the teachers are essentially white teachers, and a lot of the students are not. I know this paper doesn't really kind of cover this area, but is there work being done to kind of address that as well, sort of getting more representation in terms of the teachers themselves?
I definitely think that there is a big push in education to try and have an increase in the number of the amount of diversity in teaching. It's a really large push. Almost everyone you talk to is talking. There are lots of people that talk about that. So I think that there is. Teaching right now is a hard field. People are leaving because of the pressures they felt since COVID.
Yes.
And it's really hard to get anybody to stay right now. It's hard for people to stay in public education, which is where a lot of our kids would be. And so I think that that's a challenge right now. And so it's a big conversation that's happening. And I don't think anybody really has an answer to it. It is definitely an issue of, where students are coming from. So you need to start much earlier, high school, middle school, with getting to students and exposing them to positive experiences in education for them to come. There's just a large disparity in diversity. So, yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't have an answer to it. I just think that it's a problem that lots of people are trying to address.
Well, I'd even consider sort of the whole, I mean, I'm not in education, but I didn't even consider the whole COVID thing and how that's really, I mean, that's pushed folks out of a lot of different jobs in a lot of different fields, for sure. I mean, the great, what is it? What is it called? The
resignation,
the great resignation, of everything. And certainly, the pressures of trying to do online learning and all these other crazy things, and sort of course dealing with medical things. I didn't even think of that as sort of, you're trying to sort of, because I was sort of thinking more about sort of just the systems, HR systems and whatnot, and all the bias embedded in those to not even hire folks from sort of diverse backgrounds. But if you're not even getting applicants, then that's got to be,
well, they're
craziness.
being hired. There's a man named Curtis Jones. He does research in this area. So, and he talks about how they're hired. So school districts hire, teachers, diverse teachers. But what happens is within the process of evaluating them, in the process of doing the things that retain them. So they don't often have mentors. The work of, I have to remember her name. I'll try and look it up before we get off the podcast. But Linda Darling Hammond out of California talks a lot about this and how they don't work on issues of retention. So they need mentors when they come in. Those first couple years of teaching, you need a lot of support. But what Curtis Jones has found is that in the evaluation process, when a white administrator comes in and evaluates a teacher of color, they evaluate them in a much stricter way than they do other people.
Wow.
And as a result of that, they end up pushing them out of those places through the evaluation. And also Black, I call them teachers from the global majority, Black and brown teachers are often also given the students who have the worst behavior issues. So they're given students. So there's already bias in schools where children who are Black and brown are placed in classrooms for special ed more often than other kids are. They're disciplined more. So then they get put into the classrooms of Black and brown teachers who then feel very frustrated. So then and so these are things that Curtis Jones has documented. Linda Darling Hammond has the whole report on it. And so they're within the systems that should retain teachers is bias is built into those practices. I'll say practices that are biased. We don't know what people think. We just know what they do. And those practices result in a lack of retention.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's probably the answer I was kind of expecting. Lots and lots of systems problems here. And that seems to be.
And I think I kind of want to add to that a little bit. I think some of the things we've seen lately is sort of an elevation around culturally responsive teaching, and I think that's where we can address while we're waiting to see, can we develop systems that are less biased, that are inclusive, culturally responsive practices and teaching. That's, I think, the other piece that we can elevate and implement within schools so that even if we never get to the place where, the teachers and the students have the same backgrounds, at least the teachers who are in place and in charge of the curricula and the educational piece are aware of, and respectful and look at the cultures of the children who they're serving. And also they're looking at the students through a strength-based model as opposed. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me okay? Is this better?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Margo was saying, though, that's the premise of Gloria Ladson-Billings' work. So she was at UW-Madison and was trying to address some of the same issues we're talking about. And one of the things she said when she developed this framework was, we can't wait until we have a more diverse teaching force. Yes, we're reaching for that. And there is research showing that all students benefit from having a teacher of color, right? Curtis Jones' work shows that. But she says, until that time, we got to get the people ready who are already there. And so that's why she developed this framework. One of the reasons that we wrote about in the article, because she wanted to help teachers know how can you be successful when you're teaching children. And she focused on African-American children. And this framework has now been applied to people with disabilities and all kinds of different groups within education who are recipients of education. But that was her rationale. So Margo, I think that's spot on what you're saying in terms of having to prepare the people who are already there.
And
please. Do that in behavior analysis as well, right? Because those same issues are not excluded. It's not that, ABA as a field, we're not above, way above some of those same issues. Like, I think we deal with some of the same things. And that's why I think at this point in time, we're talking a little bit more about culturally relevant practices and how do we prepare individuals to work with diverse learners and to really look at their culture and their context. And, so I think there's that, and that's part of where ABA and education is such a huge sort of area where we can work together to push the work forward, both in both fields and together.
Yeah, and part of that, the interesting thing is, I just want to add to that, the interesting thing is that for all of our desire to do that, we unfortunately live in a political climate that is working against that, right? We have a vocal minority, or sometimes now majority in certain places, that are working to, to basically spin this myth, right? That culturally relevant pedagogy is somehow trying to shame white people into, feeling guilty and responsible for all the woes of the world. Okay. Facing your historical past is not the same thing as people trying to guilt and shame you. And the other side of that is that it's really about recognizing your own personal biases based on your own cultural identity, right? Everyone has conscious and unconscious bias.
Yes.
Period. And it's not always about race either. People have a lot of unconscious and conscious bias against mental health issues, against getting help for those issues, against disabilities, how they perceive different types of disabilities. Even working with teachers, providing some training around that. There was one particular disability that we brought up, and they had so many questions and so many like judgments, and I had to bring up to them, well, why is that? Why do you think that is? And we had to work through that, and what questions you might ask yourself and what experiences you may have had that make you feel and question so much around this particular issue. And those are the kinds of things that we need to be doing in order to overcome that when we're working with people of different cultures. And very specifically in these cases with Black children, because we have such a high disparity with prison rates, with brutality, police brutality, and death rates in this country. And not just boys, but girls and women. The rates for girls and women and the treatment of them in schools and by police is growing by leaps and bounds in terms of how their interactions and their negative interactions with authority figures. So, this is really important on so many levels across so many systems. These are things that behavior analysis can address. We've, started to scratch the surface in reading and literacy education and schools, but there are many areas that this can apply.
If I can sorry, go ahead, Margo.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that one thing that hit me when I came to UW Milwaukee, they asked us to do an evaluation, kind of to incorporate culturally relevant pedagogy into our work, because it is such a huge part of what happens in Wisconsin, and Gloria Latson-Billies was at UW-Madison at the time. And I remember thinking, I don't know that changing people's attitudes changes their behaviors. As a behavior analyst, it's hard for me to think that if I go in and I help anyone address their attitude, and I measure that in some way, whatever we're measuring, like, are you racist? Are you not? Correct. By your attitude, by your self-report. If I change what you say about yourself, how you perform on some measure, it doesn't necessarily mean my behaviors will change. The same is true in classrooms. When everybody was like, I want to be anti-racist, that's great. It should happen. We need to interrogate our own bias. We need to be thinking about our own attitudes.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily make you a better person to teach someone to read. If at the end of the day, if you perform better on a measure of bias, but your kids leave your classroom, they still cannot read, we have not done anything. And I strongly believe it has. And so that's why I think behavior analysts really can add value to this, is that we're not just looking at behavior, we're looking at attitude, we're looking at behavior. And culturally relevant pedagogy differs from culturally responsive pedagogy in that culturally relevant pedagogy, by the way that it was intended, was to empower the kids to survive a system that was not built for them. So when you're teaching them to be social, to know their culture and someone else's cultural competence, you're teaching them. Amoy was saying, like, people's perspectives on, feeling guilty and things like that. I'm like, forget that. Teach the kids their culture. Teach Black children their history accurately. Teach Hispanic children their history accurately, so that they're empowered to survive a system that tells them that they're not beautiful, that tells them that they're not brilliant. And so I think it's really important to understand that that's what that meant, where culturally responsive pedagogy is about what the teacher does to prepare themselves. And that's different. We want to empower kids. We want kids to be strong and healthy so they can be successful in a system that pushes against them. And then we also want to focus on behaviors, not just attitude, in my opinion.
The second secret word is Frisbee.
Yeah, and a good question for that is, what is the difference between noncompliance and self-advocacy? That's one line that people always ask, that people are starting to ask the question more. And I ask behavior analysts, I'm currently the clinical director for Infinity Behavior. And that's a question that whenever I read a behavior plan now, It's what is the difference between noncompliance and self-advocacy. And there's a difference between task refusal and straight up noncompliance. Like, I'm not going to do that, I won't do that, and so on, versus not doing a task. But where's that line, right? At what point do you have to allow people to be autonomous people with their own agency? And oftentimes, I think that we will label someone as non-compliant based on our own personal bias. If they have a disability, they're non-compliant. If they are, Black, maybe they're non-compliant. If they have, a nose ring or tattoos, they're non-compliant.
Yep.
Versus, if they're your friend's child, or if, they're your favorite student in class, they're self-advocating, So there has to be some place for self-advocating, for for saying no, and allowing that. And also, at what point does that so-called, quote, non-compliance actually equate to lack of consent or assent to certain interventions and procedures? So a lot of these things have to be taken in consideration within that lens of cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity and individual instructional histories. So this is why it's so important to understand the individual and the culture of the people that you work with. One person's compliment is another person's microaggression, right? So, and so it is, it is our responsibility to know the people that we serve, and to be curious and to ask the question rather than assume, and that goes for gender, it goes for disability, that goes for race, that, all of those things. If you want to be effective in anything you do, you have to start at that point, and acknowledge your own bias. Everyone has them. I've got plenty of them. And at certain points, I have to think to myself, even when I respond in certain ways to my own child, like, whoa, am I projecting here? What am I doing here? Or why am I so bothered by this? Right? And put that back on myself to ask myself the question, as opposed to what they're doing. They shouldn't do that. They should know how to do something. And rather ask the question, why am I so bothered by this? Why am I finding this so frustrating? And that gets to better answers, to make me better able to handle those situations than being frustrated in those situations, and possibly being a more effective practitioner, a more effective teacher, a more effective mentor. So those things, I think come out of a desire to be better for, the people we serve, rather than this idea of, well, I'm not going to be forced to change my behavior or who I am. And to piggyback off what Denise was saying, we don't think our way into behaving. I think I want to be, lose 50 pounds all the time, but we behave our way into thinking. So if I do this small thing on a regular basis, then I can look back and reflect and say, oh, I think that actually worked, because now I can see the result of my behavior. And that's when the thinking and attitude can change. Right. So I think that's, that's something, there's something to be said for that.
I interrupted Margo, so I'm sorry, Margo. I didn't want to interrupt you. So,
and poor Mya, she didn't get a word in edgewise over there.
It's totally fine. I think you definitely summarized a lot better what I was thinking and what I wanted to say. So you made the point.
Amoy, it's interesting. Something in particular, all of it definitely really interesting. But one thing you said that kind of has stuck with me for a few moments is this idea that topographically, a behavior can look the same and yet be labeled completely different because of the bias. And so that, one student is self-advocating and one student is non-compliant, and they're both doing the same thing. That's just something I never even thought of in terms of, applying the bias in that way. Yeah. Okay. So everyone was apologizing because Maya didn't get a word in. So Maya, maybe you could jump in here and tell me a little bit more about what sort of this culturally relevant pedagogy. I see it's goji, not gaji. Thank you for the pronunciation. Actually is.
Tomato.
That's right.
I'm great. There are so many great, amazing women here that everyone, and I mean, we've all worked together now for a bit, so it's no need to get my word in there. But I say pedagogy, but I do hear people say pedagogy. I've never Googled the pronunciation. I don't know if anyone here feels 100% confident. But I would personally like to defer to Denise on this because
okay.
I think this is Dr. Ladison Billings was also at University of Wisconsin, correct?
Yeah.
And I just feel like this is your wheelhouse for sure.
Fair enough.
It's not my wheelhouse, but I can describe it.
But you probably brought it to everybody initially, I guess.
Right. What I was going to say, because I struggled when I got there with how does this fit into being a behavior analyst? So they were like, do this work. And I just thought, where do we fit? And it was through one of the tenets that she talks about that I'll just describe that I saw where we could fit. And then over time saw how behavior analysis could actually be used to shift certain behaviors that we were seeing in schools. But so Gloria Ladson Billings was concerned about how but Black children in particular were framed negatively in literature. So when you talked about them, when they were written about, they were talked about as their deficits, right? So they, through a deficit lens, not that they had deficits, but that's how they were described. So they were described as having only so many of Black children read, this many Black children have negative behaviors. And it was very negative. And so she said in her book, I learned this from reading about it. She said that she wanted to change that narrative, change that framework. So she began to look at teachers and trace what they were doing. And she went to a school that Black students were performing, the Black students were performing well. And she looked at a cohort of, I think it was 8 teachers. And she just did a qualitative study of their work, a deep longitudinal study. What are they doing that's making their children in their classroom succeed? And what she found was that there were 3 areas. Number one, they ensured that their students had academic excellence. They didn't lower the standards. They kept the standards high, but they also empowered the students to meet those standards. Number 2 was that one of the other areas was that the students had what she called cultural competence. What she meant by that was that they knew their own culture and someone else's culture. Really what she meant was that they knew their culture and they knew the larger dominant culture, because to survive, they had to have both. And then the third one was that they had socio-political awareness. They could interpret the events around them through their own lenses. So if something happened in the world, they could talk about it in the classroom. And with looking at those 3 areas, she concluded that the group of teachers she worked with, that's what they did to ensure that that Black children were succeeding. And then it really took off, and it became a national. People adopted this nationally. And then if you read through literature on it, you've seen it applied to lots of different groups, different racial groups from different racial ethnic backgrounds, different groups, like Amoy was saying, with disabilities. And so it became a way to positively do what they call an asset-based description, not one that's based on deficits of the children who previously were not. And her big goal, as I said before, was to empower the kids to survive the system. So how do you empower them to be successful in a system that sometimes is not supportive of them?
Well, can you break down the sort of 3 components? I just thought these were the coolest things I've ever read. The 3 components of the CRP. But maybe if you could just sort of explain it for the listeners.
Sure, I'll try, and then anybody can jump in.
Yeah.
So academic excellence, as I said, was that they would be children who could perform well in school and do well and be successful in school. And so that you didn't have that description of an achievement gap, right? These children were able to succeed academically. Sociopolitical awareness, it was that they could look at events in the world and then interpret them for themselves. So for instance, if you had something happen in another country, they could connect that back to their own community. And then cultural competence was them knowing their own culture and exposing them to their own culture, and then also making sure that they knew how to navigate the culture that required them to survive the school system.
Yeah.
These seem like really big areas for maybe a little guy or gal. Is this something that's starting like it says PK to 12? So is this stuff you're doing in kindergarten?
Well, part of it is, go ahead, Denise.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say part of it is, it's like the prerequisites to being able to do these things, right? I mean, at certain, we talk a lot of times about, especially for Black families and for, other underrepresented groups, having the talk, right? And which is like, at what point you have to talk about the dangers of the world, kind of how you may be looked at differently by police, how you may have to carry yourself a little differently in certain neighborhoods because you may be profiled or considered a danger to others, right?
Yes.
If you're in a group of friends, like how you have to conduct yourself. So some of those things are naturally happening in the households of children already at very young ages.
Yeah, I guess
and
so.
part of that is what sets up that sociopolitical awareness. It's understanding and making explicit those power dynamics in mainstream society. The police have it's a power dynamic between them and the so-called citizenry that they serve, right?
Yeah.
We learned that they're not there, and they actually had to remove these mottos on the side of their cars to serve and protect, because that's actually not their job. Their job is to, arrest criminals, and enforce the law. So there are times when they do not have to take action. So some of those things are, build that baseline awareness of the world around them. And they start to understand those dynamics in their own culture and the dominant culture and how those things are different. Okay. So those are some of the things that, from a young age start to be revealed through everyday experiences, and then through the discussions that are had at home and through their observations in their family units and their and then their neighborhoods sometimes, right? And if they're not, they come into contact with that at some point. It may be delayed, right? But intentionally having these conversations or talking about this, helps to empower students to understand these dynamics, and then drawing those together in historical context and with different cultures in different parts of the world, and what's happening around the world, politically, socially, like Russia and Ukraine or different things like that, helps them to understand and see those and connect with that information and connect it to how similar or different it is to their own experience. And those connections is what leads to academic excellence, right? Because it allows for more scaffolding, it allows for more clarifying of the curriculum, it allows for those real world connections to the information that they're learning in class, which then provides the motivation to learn. Because if you can connect with something, you find the subject matter more interesting, you're more connected to it, you're more invested in it. But if it has, and you don't see any relevance to your own life or your own world experience, the motivation is not there. And we know specifically for, certain kids, especially like us neurodivergents with ADHD, we already have diminished motivation, right?
Yeah.
So that also helps for children with different, with disabilities and who are challenged through being, neurodivergent and are lacking some of those things already. So when you're making all of these connections, it helps to increase the academic excellence. And you're looking from that strength, what they do well, as opposed to constantly criticizing. Those things also lead to, improvements and more effective teaching and better outcomes.
Mm. Mm.
Ben, can I just jump in for a second? I just want to toss this back to Mya and Margo for a moment, but I was thinking about in the article some of the ways we connected behavior analysis to culturally relevant pedagogy. So I'm wondering, so Amoy was talking about how we look through an asset lens, and I wonder if there are aspects of behavior analysis like approval. Are there things that we naturally do with kids that lend themselves to some of the goals that Gloria Latz and Billings had? I'm just curious now about that.
I think we did a little bit of that in our article.
We did, and I'm the last author on purpose because I was not as engaged with it, which is why I'm bringing this up.
Okay,
I thought they did a great job.
Author, which is why I'm talking so much.
No, I missed the question. I'm so sorry.
I just said, I'm curious about if you guys have opinions, if anybody has opinions about how behavior analysis can kind of align itself with CRP. That's what I was challenged with in doing this. And we actually fleshed it out in this paper, and I was so glad for it. So I'm just wondering what you guys think.
I think I'm not going to take the motivation piece because Dr. Margo owns that one, but I'll talk about something that I personally connected with and still use practices for today in my teaching, positive behavior supports, and how important it is just having, clear expectations, targeted evidence-based instruction that we know is high quality instruction for the majority of the classroom, especially when we're looking for targeted academic excellence piece, academic achievement, and connecting material specifically to current events, what's happening in the world, things that specifically relate to things that are meaningful to the students. Self-management, I think, is a big one also, right? We see oftentimes students struggle, not necessarily because they don't have the capability to complete an assignment, but because it's harder because a lot of students that I at least work with, they have a job, they have families, they have life events, multiple jobs even. And so it's about helping to teach them ways to organize their time and be more successful, and strategies for even studying is a big one. So I think for me personally, I see this manifest in positive behavior supports and even response to intervention, that type of conceptualizing, targeting the success of all students by using that high quality evidence-based instruction that the majority of students will respond to, and then providing additional supports and attention for students that may need them.
Yeah.
I have two thoughts. You asked earlier about application of this work within how early do you start? When do you start talking about some of these?
Yeah.
I in some of the work I'm doing, we have some preschoolers that we're working with in the literacy program, and some of our children have experienced just lots of adverse they have adverse experiences from within the community and so on, and a lot of that shows up with them when they enter the room. Now we're with them like 2 hours a day, not a long time, not together all day.
But I think the environment, the class space, maybe we've created this safe space enough to where when they enter the room and some things have happened in the community and to them, it's evident, and I see it in the way that they're engaging.
In the community, as opposed to saying, well, what's going on with this kid? There are lots of things. Being in tune with the cultural context of an individual will really actually kind of tell you some setting events, some motivating operations that might, or abolishing operations that may be in place that may explain why the behaviors are occurring. So I think really taking time to look at the full context. Even in preschool, I have some kids who come in and say, hey, I saw this person get shot and this, that, and that happened.
Yeah.
6-year-olds.
Wow.
And they're expressing that, well, my mom, my parent passed away, and so you're in the classroom and you can't shut something like that down. This is the experience the individual has at the moment, and it impacts what they're doing or able to do, how motivated they are. And so I think really helping them to connect to the world, and understanding, why is this happening? Why am I being treated this way? All these things come up in the classroom. And I think when you create a space where the children are able to express that, you can then be responsive and address it, modify what you're teaching, how you're teaching, to be able to address some of those things and teach that self-advocacy, teach those social skills to be able to have, strong language and description and discussion about things that are happening. So I don't think there's like a time where it's too early. Now, if you have, limited verbal repertoire, that's sort of a different story, but I think you can start as early as things are happening for that individual. And then I think maybe the other thought in terms of how ABA can align with CRP in general is where I think right now in the field, really looking at culture and looking at the importance of culture, the role that culture plays within behavioral practices and treatment planning and target selection. So I think that's another huge thing that we really have to tune into as a field, and that we can learn from education and, attending to the importance of that, demonstrating that we have respect for that culture, but also empowering our clients and our families to celebrate their culture, right? So wherever you're from, I don't have to choose targets just because these are what, Western norms dictate are the targets. I can choose targets based on the values of the home, the culture of the home, and that you all as a family can implement and support. And so I think there's lots of things we can do and learn from education and how they've, applied CRP in general.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Wondering about, so yesterday I interviewed Dr. Intarachot Van Etten, NISA, about culturally responsive ABA. And we were talking about, how there's definitely a place for, sort of kind of broad cultural norms and educating in kind of that area, but that, no Black family is the same, or no Latino family is the same, right? And so to sort of, you've got to be really careful not to make assumptions about each family. Again, it's a bias, even if you think it's going in a good way, it can be a bias by sort of, you applying these broader norms to the individual. How do you sort of address that in something like this, where you're trying to sort of create a climate, a system, in a school where, you're teaching kids these sorts of things? Are you interviewing families and those sorts of things to sort of, get those individual sort of kind of culture pieces from the home so you can bring them into the school? Like, how does that work? I think because we spent a lot of time learning about, ABA has been putting a lot of papers out on culture and culture responsive, and I think there's, I said this yesterday, there's like 7 or 8 terms now that all start with culture, from humility to safety to competence to awareness to responsiveness to relevant. And I know I'm also kind of making it a mission to try to interview someone from every country on the planet. But is that a wasted mission to interview one person from Botswana? Because I interviewed one person from Botswana. If everybody in Botswana is different, sort of thing. And so it's a 2-part question. One, selfish: am I wasting my time interviewing someone from every country? And 2, how do we sort of, how do you individualize this pedagogy? How does that all work?
So I just saw Margo do a great talk the other day on something like this. I'm hoping she'll talk about her work and her assessments and everything.
Well, I guess one, you can now say you've also interviewed someone from Rwanda, so that could be a little take on your on the work that you're trying to do. But I don't think it's a waste to say that you're interviewing a person from a certain country or culture. The reality is we all, even within the Black community, even within the Hispanic community, you're going to find subcultures. You're going to find lots of different things that people do you know what I mean? So I don't think it's a waste. I think it can give you a general understanding maybe of a region in some cases, right? It can give you an idea. But I do think it's important to really individualize and yes, assess each individual that you will never go and create a treatment plan without having assessed all, hopefully, right? Without having done your FBA, without understanding, contextual things that are going on with the individual, you wouldn't do that because then that's not, now you may not, I think it's important to also be practical. I don't think you need to do 20 different assessments about your culture and your values and stuff, but you can embed it in the work that you're doing. So some of the work that we do needs assessments within the program. So I will, when I meet the families and we're doing enrollment or intake process, in that case, when I'm getting to know a family, I will ask some questions. And as we build our relationship, I may ask, what are dynamics? What are they willing to share? And as, we have that strong rapport and relationship, they're more willing to be open about the needs that they may be experiencing, right? Sometimes as children will tell you the needs that they're experiencing. The client will, engage in a way that you have an idea of what's going on. I think it's important not to assume everybody's a monolith. Not all people are, exactly the same. Yeah, not the same. We may have similar values. We may have similar cultures. But I will tell you, like in my country, we have 3 different tribes. We all speak the same language, but you may have some differences. In some countries, you may have 500 languages. You cannot assume what's happening in the north is happening in the south. Some individuals, some Black and BIPOC individuals are, middle class, high class. So they have, they're not living in poverty. You can't make that assumption. But I think what's important is, yes, spend the time, get to know the individual, do needs assessments, make sure you have a clear understanding before you make any, or if you find yourself making assumptions, just go back and ask. And build a relationship where the individuals feel safe enough and heard, and they feel valued to where what they tell you about themselves is valued and is demonstrated through treatment planning, through programming, through target selection. So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, involve them, basically. I mean, at the end of the day, right? I mean, you have to talk to people and you have to treat them like humans and not be arrogant and think you know everything. And you have to ask them questions about what they want. Like what outcomes are they looking for? You can't just assume that, what their priorities are, So, I mean, one of the things I ask parents every time is, what are your priorities? Sometimes it's about safety and awareness. And that looks different for different people and at different ages and stages, right? So for one family, it may be crossing the street, but for another family, it may be how to respond to authority figures. Okay? Because that could cause a severe hazard for one group of people and not others, right? So, and for, also there's things that come into play for religion, right? In terms of culture, so there are a lot of nuances when it comes to culture. You may have a culture, be dealing with people who have a culture where, the male is the head of the household and certain things are deferred. And so certain skills like maybe cooking or washing clothes may not be a high priority for certain ADL skills for the male, if you have a male client in that type of household or culture. Whereas, it may be for someone else, right? So there are a lot of things that may be considered a priority or a higher priority over others based on some of those nuances. And you just have to ask the question, and you have to involve people and then review those things with them before you just, go about your business and, distributing goals and determining that these are the things that are important,
And I think back to Margo's point about building relationships as well, both Amoy and Margo, is, you can't know all culture from one or two people, but the more we interact with other people, the more people pick up on that nuance. We pick up on
Yeah.
kind of the concept formation, right? About aspects of a culture. So I know
Sure.
in African American culture, it's inappropriate to call an older person by their first name. It's just not, it's not done. Very different. I grew up in an all-white community, and so it was very different for us as kids versus my peers. And our next door neighbor, when she was younger, she called my mom by her first name, Linda. And my mother looked at her and goes, and so she's a younger white child. And my mom goes, we do not do that. We don't do that. We call each other by our Mrs. Doctor something, but you don't say that. So she didn't understand it. She felt very upset.
Yeah.
She went on to become a special ed teacher as an adult. She teaches kids with autism. My mom said she called her a couple of years ago. She said, thank you for telling me that. Because you told me that, I now know better how to interact with the parents I work with. So I think it's your willingness as a member of a group to share that information.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think if you interact enough with people, you start to pick up on the aspects of culture, which you should respect, what's different. And that's true for any group. So and I just feel like it's also being willing to interact enough with enough people to pick up on what the differences are.
No, really, really, really good point.
I'll add one more thing.
Yeah, good.
And lastly, and I feel like this is something I see semi-regularly at least in where I'm at right now, but being open to feedback, right? I mean, what's wrong, right? If I do something wrong or offensive, I want to be told that. I don't want to have this demeanor as a practitioner or as a teacher or as any type of clinician that I'm the smartest one in the room, or I'm the professional, and what I say is what it is. We should be willing to build those relationships both ways, where I'm giving feedback and I'm receiving feedback also.
Yeah.
And if we're not open to that, or we don't project ourselves in a way that shows that, then it can create a barrier that won't allow that open communication.
Yeah.
I think that's such a good point, because I think we kind of talked about power dynamics. Like when you're the resident expert, and someone is bringing a child, yes, air quotes, resident expert, and you're either, you're in education, you're teaching the classroom, you are the expert of that classroom. The parents bring they expect that, right? At the same time, there's a certain power that you have that the parent is kind of giving up by doing that, bringing the child to the clinic, receiving treatment. There's a power dynamic that is immediately evident. And I think we really have to attend to that, because if you have certain level of experiences with power and power dynamics, and maybe you've been taught to respond to a certain way, whether it's more or less submissive or fight back, then the responses that you're going to see within the environment are going to be different. And so I think just getting to know individuals, but also understanding the power dynamic we bring to when we enter the room. When you are the expert, you don't need people to affirm that you're the expert. You know you're an expert. You have the knowledge.
Yeah.
In fact, I think you have to do you have to be humble and practice with humility and demonstrate that, yes, I know some things, but there are things that I don't know. For example, you know your kid's schedule, you know your own culture, you know your own values, and I don't know those things until you share them. And I could do my research and get an understanding, but I really don't know those things until you let me know what's happening. So if we're asking parents, like, tell me about the sleep schedule, tell me what they eat, tell me about their reinforcements, why would we not ask these other questions that are completely part of the context? So I think practicing with humility is really important, and building that empathy and understanding that fosters strong relationships. And then following up and really knowing the families that you're serving. Hey, this happened to you last week. What happened this? Getting to understand and know what your priorities are, and it really does show, and it makes a big difference, whether you're in education or in private practice.
And I think that going into schools, this is something we always did and do, is we spend a semester or a period of time just serving in schools. So we just serve there. When you first come in, we don't come in, we're not the expert. Let's be a teaching assistant in the classroom. Can I sit can I be the teacher for a day or two? From one perspective, it immerses you in the culture of the school. And so if you want to work in schools, behavior analysts, sometimes we have trouble forming those partnerships. If you want to go do it, spend some time in that school, and it's so different. Man, I was a principal for a while, and when I was when I saw how it felt to be on the other side of someone coming to me telling me they had what I needed. And I was like, no, I need you to help me take these children to the playground. That's what I need. And then you can kind of tell me how to run a fluency intervention, and so it's like, that I hadn't experienced that until then. But I think that's so important to just spend time there. But from a practical standpoint, in terms of planning interventions, it shows you where barriers are. It shows you what fidelity will look like. It shows you why they would or would not be able to implement something. I'm coming with this practice. Why aren't you doing it? You don't understand the culture of the school, what's happening there. And so when you build your intervention, we have to know, I'll say we have to know the culture of the school, what they encounter day to day, what the kids are like, so that we can help build. So even though this intervention shows me research is going to work, I've seen lots of replications, maybe it wouldn't work here the way it's written down. So I need to come in and put myself in that place. Like Margo said, be a servant in that place for a little while so I can then serve that environment, so I can then learn about it to then design an intervention.
And I feel like that's one of the things that I've really valued in all the work that we've done. Is something that I do currently in my work, and that, whoever I'm supervising and training and all of that, I impart that sort of that specific skill for them to do. I recently had an experience where I had individuals trying to do some work and research within a context of where I work, and we really have to kind of require, like, you gotta come check out the culture here. This is at the tip. You gotta come see the space, because what you're proposing and what the culture looks like and what the individuals in that space need are actually a lot different than what we have in mind. So I think it's such a big deal, and we don't always have time, right? I have a limited amount of time. Maybe you have the little hours to attend to, and maybe there may not be lots of opportunity. But this is how also we disseminate the research and the work that we're doing. Is we got to be willing to listen and learn, and then we can be teachers. We all have to go through that process. You listen, you learn, and you become a teacher. So I think that's a really important component. So I'm thankful that we got lots of those learning opportunities, because it's impacted the work that I'm doing now.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. And I don't feel like it's a waste. Thank you. I'm wondering just one about sort of application of this CRP. So, I mean, it all sounds really good, and I love the idea of educating kids on all three of those aspects early on. How do you do that? Like, how do you get a whole school to do this? I guess is kind of the question. I see as a behavior analyst coming in and serving a student or two, or maybe three or whatever, or maybe a classroom if you're in that role. I mean, I don't know a lot about being a behavior analyst in schools, so maybe I'm just missing some points here. But I'm just wondering how you how you make this happen.
I can kind of speak to that a little bit. So we are trying to do that with our work at the Institute for Urban Education. So we brought in people who were experts in each of these areas, and then we asked them to design modules that we could work with teachers on. But that's why we embrace literacy, because it's an observable, measurable approach to academic excellence. I can't do everything, but I can do this. And where's the need, right? There's a need. And so, I live in Wisconsin pre-COVID, and I say this all the time. I've heard it on other podcasts. For Black children, 11% of Black children read proficiently in Wisconsin. That was the average. The range, there were districts where 7%. So that's a need that you can address. That is an applied need. And so we can't build all academic excellence, but we can come in and work on reading, right? Behavior analysts have approaches to instructional design. And that's what we said, one of the things we said in the article, that can be brought in, right? How do you set objectives, operationalize common core standards? How do you bring in? So all of those things are ways that you can apply it, and it becomes measurable and observable, right? I think in terms of cultural competence, one of the things that, it is about the culture of the kids you're supposed to be teaching and empowering the kids. So that can come through literature, that can come through affirmation of the culture. But I think the flip side of this is the way that teachers interact with kids. I raised my goddaughter, and I got to sit in on one of her parent teacher conferences. And I saw for the first time, I didn't have children. So she was the one I raised. And it was the first time she'd gone to school. And the teacher looked at her dad, and I couldn't unmute my computer fast enough to get to the conversation to stop her from saying this. But she said to my goddaughter's father, she said, "Your daughter is behind in reading." And she was very cold when she said it. And to a parent who is a a janitor who doesn't have time to do the things that maybe we hear that you should do. That was unnerving. And he was like, what do you mean she's behind? There were no test scores. There was nothing. So for the first time, I felt what it felt like to be on the other side of having somebody give me test scores and be insensitive about the way that they're giving those.
Yeah.
And so we can change that. So what we're doing is planning to do is to work with teachers. We partnered with a woman named LaShawn Hannon from Rutgers, who's done work in this area, to work with teachers and teach them, how do you provide information? How do you walk alongside parents? I mean, that's a behavioral skill. That's a skill. Well, how do you, doctors need it. How do you say things the right way? And so that's that. And then in terms of social political awareness, working along with like social studies classes and embedding, looking at what you're doing in those classes. So there are very observable, measurable ways to embed this into what happens in schools regularly.
Cool. Good. I'm glad to hear it. Right on. Just thinking about time here, and go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, in terms of like ABA also, that now I'm trying to remember my thought. Come back to me. In terms of ABA, when we talk about caregiver training, for instance, right? And culture, we talk about that. Also, you have to consider, like Denise was just saying, the culture of work. When you go into someone's household and you're talking about how to engage in certain procedures, making changes to behaviors, meeting caregiver goals, you have to take into consideration the amount of time, the amount of support, how they're able to engage in these interventions to meet the needs and to meet the goals that they are setting. So you can't go in with all of these complicated procedures, with all of this data that you want them to collect, and then expect them to be compliant with those things, right? Like Dr. Margo was saying, like you're asking, you come in and you have a culture where, somebody has a high respect for authority or has been told to submit to authority figures. You're coming in as an authority figure. So they're already going to say yes, yes, yes to everything that you give them to do, right? And so in doing so, then you come back and they don't have any of the data that you've asked them to collect. Right. And now you're talking about, taking away caregiver training because they're not participating in parent training. So now you're talking about the possibility of losing services because they're not doing or complying with the things that you're asking them to do. But having that cultural awareness and then applying that means that you have an understanding of why they're not doing these things. You ask the questions about, is this too difficult? Do you have the time? How many other children do you have to attend to when you get home? How much time do you have when you get home to spend with your children before you have to bathe, shower, feed, and put them to bed? Okay, so you have to think about the lived realities of working parents, and parents who are going to be working with their children when you are not there to support them. Do you have other family members that help you with your children? Who is there with the children when they come home from school? So if you fail to ask some of these questions and then you just go in with a prescribed set of interventions for them, you are not being culturally aware. You're not being sensitive to their needs, and you are setting the parents up to fail and ultimately lose the services that they so desperately need. So that is really important in terms of, we talk about being sensitive to one's culture. Those are the kinds of questions that you also have to talk to the parents about, not just what they want to achieve, but realistically how they can get there, and realistically the amount of time it will take to get them there, so they don't feel like after 6 months that they're a failure because they didn't get all the way there. That this is a long-term objective, that it's small steps, and this is realistically where we may be able to go based on what you're able to do.
Amoy,
so that's really important.
I love that you said that, and while you were kind of describing that in terms of problem solving and figuring out what's working or why things, that was a really great example, because I've definitely run into those situations with certain families or certain clients. One of the things it made me think of is I don't know, I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with the performance diagnostics checklist that OBMers use. I think there are lots and lots of tools within OBM that we can actually use to figure out why are things not going and not working in the way that they should be. And all the things that you talked about, so you have the knowledge, you have the tools, you have the, you know what I mean? It's all on that checklist. So I think it's a matter of really being systematic about our approach and kind of not making those assumptions, or if you do make them, go back and check for these other things. Eliminate that these things are already in place, and if they're not, put them in place, and then you can go back to intervention.
Yeah.
And also,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if you want to hear more about this topic, I will be presenting at
Hmm.
ABAI on culture, compliance, and consent.
Cool.
I'll see you there. I'm going.
I'll be there too.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I'll
then,
be here.
Dr. Ross, I think you. No, yeah, you gotta come. It's gonna be in Denver, right? So you gotta come. Dr. Ross, I really like the way that you summarize the way that we, individuals can apply, whether educators or clinicians can kind of apply the 3 tenets that CRP talks about. I also think that, you've got to choose one thing and at least start there. Do one thing and do it well. And I think once you build that behavioral momentum, I don't think it has to be as complicated as it may sound. I think it's, do you respect can you create an environment where children are celebrated for their culture? That's it. Maybe start there. Can you create an environment where you look at everybody's academic excellence and how well they're doing, as opposed to focusing on their deficits and what they're not doing well? I had this experience where I was a parent in a reading program. Some of the supports we provide are behavioral supports in the classroom. Parents will say, my child is, they got kicked out of school, they're getting in trouble, they're, all these things are happening. A lot of it is related to their, the reading difficulties that they're having, literacy difficulties, because that is a huge component that impacts, especially as they get older, so many other subject areas. You can't do math comprehension questions if you can't read. You can't do science social if you can't read. And so kids are engaging in all these challenging behaviors across the day. And that is kind of serving a certain function at some point. And now, they're also experiencing implicit bias. And so anyway, so I got called in to support this family. And I sat in this meeting and I had at least like 5 different, educators, and I just asked them, tell me what's happening. I just want to hear your perspective, your experience. I want to know what's going on. Mom had already told me, but I wanted to hear from the teaching team. And so everyone kind of went around, and I kid you not, for maybe, 30, 40 minutes, everybody told me all the things that were wrong with this kid. This is what he does wrong. This is what he does wrong. 40 minutes. I really timed it because I was like, I really want to hear. So at the end of that, one of the first question I asked was, what does he do well? That's the only, what does he do well? What is he good at? And I'm not talking about apologize. So that was one thing they told me. He apologizes when he does something wrong. He knows when he did something.
Oh my gosh.
40 minutes. This was a 3rd grade student.
So imagine how many corrections he gets in a day and how many positive statements are made to him.
Right.
Think on that.
That's an intense thing, so I left that meeting just feeling so sad. And so I was like, I have to make sure in the work that I'm doing that not only am I celebrating, are we creating a culture where we're celebrating the children the minute they enter the classroom, we're also expecting the best out of them. We're creating goals that make sense, that are at the level that they need. We're focusing on this huge sort of behavioral cost literacy, ensuring that they're going to succeed not only academically, but also behaviorally later on. And I think that's where you have to start is start somewhere. And then I think slowly you're going to see an impact across the board. So really focusing on building those positive interactions is a good way to sort of restore some of those things. And that will build a repertoire where you look at a kid and you look at what are they good at, you look at their strengths. And, we always talk about, I always say, whatever you focus on is what's going to grow. So if you're looking for strengths, you're going to see more of them. And so I think that's another way of, I think it's feasible. Just start somewhere and don't maybe not try to do the whole thing. Just start somewhere. And kind of from there.
And practically speaking, in schools, regardless of kid cultures in schools, where you see bias play itself out is in disapprovals and approvals.
Right.
So you see more disapprovals happen for kids, certain groups of kids than others. So if we could just shift that, right, where we begin to have more approvals than disapprovals, goes back to what Mya was saying about positive behavior supports and that 5 to 1 kind of ratio where you have more approvals and disapprovals. But regardless, if you just approve the kid, give the kid more approvals, their behaviors. Kindergartners get one district we work with here. They put kindergartners in an alternative school for behavior issues. That's not this and these. And it's a problem. It's a problem. And a lot of the kids that come in are kindergartners. Most of them are Black boys. So when you talk about that, it's approvals and disapprovals. We know, and so that's what I was saying earlier. How can ABA align itself with CRP? I think we provide very practical ways of applying it.
Yeah, I really like the behavioral cusp piece. I mean, I think literacy is probably the biggest behavioral cusp there is in sort of education. It just opens up the doors to so many things. Yeah. So that's awesome. So interesting. Very cool. But before we kind of wrap up, I wouldn't mind just hearing a little bit about, we've touched a bit on it already, but just hearing a little bit about the projects folks are working on right now. I know Margo posted kind of yesterday or something about a big grant. So I want to hear about that. And I just want to hear what everybody's doing. The third secret word is teacher. Margo.
Thank you, Ben. So I mentioned that I'm doing the work within the YWCA in Kalamazoo and early childhood, and the grant that we recently received is really in implementing a behavioral instructional model that will increase literacy outcomes for primarily Black and Brown children. It's a diverse group of children, but the majority of the children that the Y serves are Black children. 85% of them children come from impoverished backgrounds. And so that the cards are already stacked against them. So our goal is to improve those literacy outcomes, make sure that they're prepared to enter school either on level or in advanced with advanced skills. And also to look at the behavioral outcomes and look at how we can foster positive environments to ensure that teachers are building classrooms that nurture and focus on restorative practices within classrooms. So that's a sort of a big project we're going to be, QABA will be consulting on and working on over the next 2 years. And then, of course, our school opening is another one. So we're here to open up in 2023, this year in the fall. And so we're working towards that. And this is a
awesome.
small piece of that work as well. So.
Margo, just quickly, how sort of big of a program is the Y? Like, how many kids are you serving? I'm just trying to get a
oh
picture.
My goodness. So YWCA in Kalamazoo, it's a pretty large organization. I want to say overall we're serving approximately 100 children, ages, like 3 months all the way to up to maybe 12th grade. So we have an infant and maternal and infant classroom. We have infant classrooms, we have toddler classrooms, we have classrooms, we have preschool classrooms, and then we have a 24-hour, 24/7 childcare program. So our goal is to implement, this project with some of our population, and then hopefully through sort of collateral, see some of that roll out into all of the centers that we're working in at this time. So we're serving a pretty large group of.
So awesome. What's anybody else doing anything cool? Or maybe it's not cool, but it could be cool.
Yeah, I'm doing some cool stuff. I'm working on personal growth and wellness. Working on getting my senior daughter into college.
Those are big projects. Yeah, big projects.
And I'm working on, I'm the clinical director for a new clinic agency that started here in Central Florida. So I'm working really hard with that and trying to build a culture of, a culture that celebrates people where they are. And that's kind of what I'm doing. And, I'm still doing my part-time teaching. I have students in Hong Kong and China.
Oh, yes, that's right.
A QABA, QBS program, Knowledge Network in Hong Kong. And so those are some things I'm doing and working on finalizing everything for ABAI culture, compliance, and consent. So come on and see me there.
That's a great title. That's a great title. Denise, Mya, what are you guys up to?
I am going to publish my dissertation this year. We have this.
Yeah.
Everybody is. Yeah.
We have a writing group, so it's the goal. It's going to happen. I'm
Amazing.
also we just started our semester this year, so I've got an awesome group of students.
Yeah.
Always excited, even though it's chaos in the beginning.
Yeah.
And then non-behavior analytic related, always going to plug. I was signed for the Premier Ultimate League for the Women's Professional League of Ultimate Frisbee.
Ooh,
and I
so cool.
Awesome.
I played for the Indianapolis Reds, so that's coming up my season.
Yes, I thought I read about Indianapolis.
Aye.
That's so awesome. I didn't even know there was a Premier League. How many teams are there? You think?
Oh, so we just added some new ones. Actually, we just added one out of Philadelphia and maybe one more. But we should have like around 7 or 8. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll have to look back into it. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, really cool.
Okay.
And Denise?
Okay, I was trying to make a list of some things. So some of the things in my day-to-day work, I am chair of the Institute for Urban Education. So our goal is to affect the practices of educators throughout Wisconsin, particularly in the area of culturally relevant pedagogy and how it affect disproportionality and issues of discrimination. And so that's where literacy comes in. I'll talk about that in a moment. We do it through research, professional development, and clinical placement. We recently have started recording a series of speaker series where people who are educators and professionals who are affected by disparities or who are part of the communities that are affected come together to talk, almost in a podcast format, but they're recorded videos as well.
Gotcha.
Those are available to anybody in University of Wisconsin system. We work with all 13 campuses, but they are also available for CEUs through the UWM continuing education.
Oh, perfect.
So I'm trying to move it so BCBAs can get CEUs too. So keep an eye out for that. We're trying to make sure that can be there. We are currently doing some on literacy. We just recorded one yesterday with researchers who do work in that area, and we'll do another one in a couple weeks.
So cool.
We're doing 2 research projects through the Institute for Urban Education. One of them is called Spaces. It's affinity groups for teachers of color to support retention and their success.
Cool.
But the other, so if you're a teacher and you want to participate, you can look on the Institute for Urban Education's website at UW Milwaukee. But also we have a larger project called Literacy and Social Justice. And the goal is to talk about how literacy and effective instruction is a form of social justice for students who have been historically marginalized. So lots of things are happening with that. So one of them is we're doing a research project. We're looking for teachers who want to participate. There is a small compensation. And so if you're interested in that, and I'm going to probably reach out to behavior analysts as well in some ways for that. So if you're interested in doing it, you can reach out. Again, go to our website. It's on there. Doug Greer and I are editing a new book that will come out this year called When Tech Speaks, Reading to Learn, Learning to Read. It's on a behavior analytic approach, the science applying the science of behavior, a strategic science of teaching to reading, and it's edited. So all the ladies on this call are authors, but we also have lots of other authors. So that's coming out, Sloan Publishing this year.
Amazing.
I am associate editor of Behavior and Social Issues as well. Just got appointed to that.
Cool.
So we have a special issue call that deadline is April 1st. It is on literacy and social justice. It's about the contributions of behavior, the science of behavior, behavior analysis, as well as the social justice side. So if you want to write on either one of those pieces, either a social justice issue related to reading for historically marginalized children, or you want to talk about a contribution you've made through your own research or have a conceptual article, you are welcome to submit. We are accepting our submissions now, and that deadline is April 1st. And it sounds like, we just started a new applied behavior analysis program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee that's starting in July of this year, focused on racial equity and behavior analysis.
Wow.
So that's what I'm doing.
Woo!
You can come and do any of those things. And I'd love to have people apply. It's all online.
Yeah.
So if anybody's interested, it's approved. It's a BCS approved through ABAI. So you can come and you can, I'm always teaching one. I think we're going to try and get her to teach one of the classes. But yes, we'd love to have people come and apply and come get your BCBA with us. Come get your ABA training to apply for your BCBA. So that's it. Those are the things.
Fantastic. And when do these what's the earliest date that any of these recruitment for any of these studies closes?
It's ongoing. It's
Okay.
ongoing. So we are going to run them through next school year as well.
Okay.
But we're running them. We're looking for people to start in the spring.
Okay.
And then so if you can apply before May, and then
Okay.
again we'll run a summer cohort. So if you just go to the website, again, Institute for Urban Education at UW-Milwaukee, all the information's on there. And you can go ahead and submit your name, and we would love to have you come on.
I'm just going to make sure this episode goes out a bit earlier than I normally would, because
That would be great.
you have that April 1st date, and we don't want this to come out on the 30th.
Yes.
That sort of thing. So we'll get this out a bit earlier so folks can sign up, and I should be able to find all the links in my searches when I go back and do the editing. We'll get those all in the show notes for folks.
Sounds good.
Wow, so amazing. Thank you all for coming on. I really want to thank Margo. Because I had originally just reached out to Margo, and she opened up the floor to add all you amazing folks to this conversation. And I hope more guests do that when I call them, offer to bring their cool colleagues along, because this was just so cool and so interesting for me. I learned so much. And I know a lot of other folks are going to get a whole ton out of this. So thanks so much for being on the show. So awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
Right on.
Thank you.